Welcome to the Hammer Territory Podcast. My name is Shawn Coleman. Hope wherever you are and wherever you are listening, you're having a great start to your Tuesday. And of course, All-Star Week is here, and we've just finished the Home Run Derby, and we are going to have an all-star version of this Hammer Territory podcast as you not only get two, but three of the four-man group here at Hammer Territory, myself, Scott Coleman, and Stephen Tolbert tonight as we talk about All-Star Week and also what's to come ahead for the Braves. But first, we'll get to my podcast partner. Scott, how are you doing tonight, sir? Good to talk with you again.
Hey, Shawn, I'm doing really well. Nice to do a three-man pod. We, of course, used to do a lot of these back in the day with Talking Chop and Battery Power, but I believe this is the first three-man that we have done on Hammer Territory. It's very nice to be on with you and with Steven tonight.
Absolutely, and I think that this is the case. And Stephen, I know that me and you usually are talking about, all the different things that are going on, and typically here recently, it's been us talking about, how disappointing the Braves offense has been. But I know that you tonight kind of endured more than enjoyed the Home Run Derby. Of course, Stephen over at Battery Power, recap the Home Run Derby. But we'll start there. Marcell Ozuna was in the Home Run Derby. A little bit of anticipation that maybe he could have a good showing. Unfortunately, he didn't. But, when I say that we've had a bit of rants in the past, this Home Run Derby, it was supposed to be entertaining. It didn't come across that way, even though there were some enjoyable moments.
It's good to be on with you guys. Obviously, it's always fun to do these, and I very much look forward to doing our first three-man pod. I think we have some interesting stuff to talk about. But yeah, the Home Run Derby. Listen, I grew up on the Home Run Derby. I was obsessed with the Home Run Derby when I was a kid. Like when it was Griffey and McGuire and Bonds and Sosa, like those things were like magical to me. The magic has certainly worn off over the years. I don't know if it's just because they change the format every year, if they really struggle to get the best home run hitters in the game to do it. This year we had Alec Boehm and, Teoscar Hernandez. And no offense to those guys. They put on as good a show as they could. But you need a certain amount of star power in these things to really drive it. Even as a Braves fan, watching Marcell was cool. But, if this thing has Aaron Judge and Shohei and Soto, it's just got more juice. So I don't really know what the league can do. But it is what it is. It's a marketing and PR event. And that's kind of what this whole week is. So I'm not going to get too upset about it. But yeah, it was like a 3-hour derby tonight. Not the greatest, not the best field to begin with, but it is what it is. But yeah, good to be on with you guys. And obviously we've got some interesting talk to get to about the Braves and where they're going to go as we approach the trade deadline.
And Scott, we also need to acknowledge just how busy this week is, a week that continues to get busier and busier because, of course, we also know that the MLB draft over the past couple of seasons has occurred during All-Star Weekend. So I'll be the first to admit myself, I'm not a draft expert, but the Braves, once again, heavily investing in pitching. But I think for many across the league, they saw us draft, one of the youngest but also most appealing arms in this draft in Cam Caminiti with the first pick in the draft. But beyond that, I think that it's a good thing that the Braves invested in Cam Caminiti. Just a few thoughts that you have on the fact that the draft's going on. And of course, we're going to see the completion of the Braves 2024 draft class tomorrow.
Yeah, so far the Braves have made 10 picks and 9 of them have been pitchers. And then they took a catcher with some pop. And lately that's been the trend for the Braves in the draft, a whole lot of pitching. And while I admittedly am not a big-time draft guru, the people who I trust and who really follow this stuff really, really like the pick of Caminiti, a player who was very likely not going to be there at 24, if you believe the scouting services. He was a projected top 15 pick, and with good reason. And at the end of the day, you're talking about a 17-year-old prep high school arm. There is such a long path ahead of him in order to make the majors. But for my money, if you're going to swing in the draft, swing for the fences. Go for a Caminiti who throws 98 with a clean motion from the left side. If everything goes right, you're talking about a top of the rotation arm for years to come. He has bloodline working in his favor. He is the kind of player who I want the Braves to go out and try to get, because you can play for floor and you can play for ceiling in these drafts, and it is such a crapshoot. But for my money, if you're going to try to add a player with the 24th pick, Caminiti was a no-brainer, and let's hope the Braves can develop him and turn him into a real weapon out of that rotation in a couple of years.
Absolutely. And you're looking at, a few years from now, Alex Anthopoulos, they've consistently gone, it's just like the setup from last year. Stephen pointed this out, in which, they probably had a plan going into the draft, but on night one, those plans kind of got scrapped when a player you didn't expect to be there was there. So kudos to the Braves for getting that value. But of course, we're here to talk about, what's to come. And I know we're in the midst of All-Star week, no games until this weekend, but what's coming up after the All-Star break is, of course, the 2024 MLB trade deadline. And in another episode later this week, we're going to go top to bottom with the roster, looking at different perspectives when it comes to what the Braves could do with the trade deadline. But in this episode, really wanted to focus on what has emerged as the number one need for this Braves team. And we've heard it rumored that the Braves are already exploring options for this need. And of course, that is the outfield addition. And Stephen, I'll throw it to you with this setup. The current situation for the Braves outfield is this. We've discussed it. Scott and Brad have discussed it. The current Braves situation is this. You've got right now at the top of the hierarchy for the Braves outfield, you've got Jarred Kelenic, who over the past 6 weeks or so has performed very well. Past week or so has struggled. But you got Jarred Kelenic, you've got Adam Duvall, you've got Eddie Rosario, you've got Eli White. Ramon Laureano possibly could be coming back, maybe this weekend. Hopefully in the next 10 days or so, maybe Michael Harris II. But the thing that I'm getting at when you look from that top to bottom of the current hierarchy for this Braves outfield, you maybe have one or two reliable everyday options. To me, when it comes to the reason why outfield is a need, you need another everyday option to really make that group formidable for what you hope can be a productive group for the playoffs.
Yeah, listen, I mean, you read off the names, right? You read off Jarred Kelenic and Adam Duvall and Eddie Rosario and Ramon Laureano and Eli White. That really doesn't sound like a group of players that should be like your 1 through 4 on a roster that's trying to win a World Series, at least in terms of the outfield. Like that really sounds like more of, that should be the names. It's like your 3 through 6 or 3 through 7. There's just not a lot of high-end talent in that position right now. Michael Harris is coming back, obviously. At least he's planning on coming back, I should say. He's got a hamstring. Hamstrings are notoriously tricky, especially for guys who use, their legs as a big part of their weapon, like a center fielder does. So obviously Michael coming back and when he comes back and how healthy and productive he's going to be when he comes back is a factor in all of this. But at the end of the day, I can spit out a ton of numbers. I can, splits left, right, OBP, slugging. Like there's a million numbers, and we'll talk about some of them tonight. But like if you just step back and just look at the names and like the talent level, like it's just insufficient. Like it's just not. That's not a talented enough outfield to help the Braves win a World Series, in my opinion. And I just think they need more. And, whether they need 1 or 2 more is probably pretty dependent on where they think Michael is in terms of his rehab. We're going to get into some names tonight a little bit and some of the teams that are potentially selling, but they just need more. I mean, they just need more talent. We can hope for guys to play better and hope Eddie Rosario plays better, Adam Duvall plays better, Kelenic gets a little more consistent, but at the end of the day, it's, a lot of times it's about talent. And I don't think the Braves have quite enough talent there. I think they need to make a couple of external moves, at least one external move, if they feel comfortable about Michael, and just add to the talent level and then go from there.
And Scott, the thing that I'll mention about it is that when you're looking, so the Braves obviously need talent. They need to elevate their talent level in the outfield. And a lot of times when it comes to trade deadlines, outfielders are one of the more, easy to come by options that you can get, especially for the Braves, who we've seen time and time again go get a player, have them improve in Atlanta versus what they did previously. It's a tale as old as time. Master of the move on the margins, Alex Anthopoulos. And so many people want to point out, we just celebrated the 3-year anniversary of us going to get Jock Peterson in 2021. People want to point out, well, he did it in 2021. He could do it this year. But one factor that's changed between now and in 2021, there's an extra playoff team. I went back and looked at the wildcard standings in 2021 at this time. There was no team within the top 2 wildcard teams by more than 3 games. The standings in the situation for the playoffs have changed. That makes the amount of outfielders and teams that are willing to trade change a bit. It's a point you brought up time and time again, but it's an important factor as to who could be available when it comes to adding an outfield addition.
Yeah, it definitely will. And if you go and look at the standings, there are as many as maybe a half dozen teams who are going to ultimately decide what they're going to do at the deadline based on the next 2 weeks once the games begin. Teams like, what do the Texas Rangers do? What do the Toronto Blue Jays do? What do the Tampa Bay Rays do? And go on down the list. And obviously, if you're the Braves, you're wanting as many teams to sell as possible. Prices generally go down when it's more of a buyer's market. And you just have more flexibility and options for who you're going to try to add in right field. I would agree entirely with both you and Steven. The Braves have to go out and add an outfielder of some kind. It may not be a superstar. I know Luis Robert is probably the biggest outfield name on the block. I mean, sure, could the Braves unload the farm to go get Robert and hope that he stays healthy? And if he is, then that's a massive addition. Sure. I'm also not sure that Alex Anthopoulos, just knowing everything we know about him, is going to unload 3 or 4 of his top prospects from a pretty thin farm system in order to go take that gamble. Does a player like Randy Arozarena become available in Tampa Bay? And we can go on down the list. But the point is that Alex kind of zigs when we expect him to zag. He has never really made the obvious move, especially recently. Who saw him going out and getting Chris Sale? I don't think that name was mentioned once all offseason connected to the Braves, even by us, people who follow the Braves and cover the Braves closely. And he goes out and adds Sale. And I think that's a point of whenever Alex, he's never afraid to look under every rock. And it would not surprise me that in a couple of weeks, if A, he were to add an outfielder, and B, if it's somebody who we maybe aren't thinking is an obvious choice.
And Stephen, the thing that I'll say is this: is that you're correct, absolutely, Scott. Alex Anthopoulos, he had the resourcefulness that he has, especially on these moves in the margins, of going to get names that we may not expect. I think is definitely something that kind of always keeps us in the loop to be able to find a valuable get, even if the number of teams that are out there are not that numerous, at least not as much as they were in the past. But Stephen, while the names may not be available, I think that one thing we could pinpoint is 1 or 2 traits in a specific outfielder that really could be a need for this Braves team. I know we've talked about someone who can get on base at the top of the lineup, obviously someone that could hit right-handed pitching. Of course, with the Braves preference, when we saw Jorge Soler do what he did in 2021, it's power potential. Could an outfielder here be more powerful than he was elsewhere? Stephen, while the names may not be obvious, what are 1 or 2 obvious traits of a potential outfield get that would really improve this Braves lineup?
When you lose Acuna, you lose a lot, but the biggest thing you lose relative to the rest of the team is on base percentage because, outside of Matt Olson, there's nobody else on the team who you would describe as on base percentage being a strength of theirs. Like it's really Acuna and Olson, maybe a little bit of Riley, but that's about it. But Acuna is far and away your most talented player in that regard. And so when you take him off, I mean, you look at the numbers. We somebody tweeted him out earlier. Scott was talking about before we went on live here, but the last 3 months or so, the Braves are dead last in the league in on base percentage. And it's even worse when you take Acuna out of the equation, who obviously won't be back this year. So you kind of need to take him out of the equation. So on base percentage is a huge part of it. The Braves do have an archetype in terms of players they like. If you go look at all of the players that Alex Anthopoulos has ever acquired, he's really a power and defense guy. Like Jared Kelenic was a power and defense acquisition. Sean Murphy was a power and defense acquisition. Matt Olson, when he came over, his reputation was power and defense. Michael Harris is a power and defense player. Before the injuries, Ozzie Albies, before all the shoulder stuff that he went through, he was a power and defense player. Orlando Arcia was a power and defense player. Like they have a type that they look for, and it's power and defense. And on base percentage is not a huge part of that. And they've been able to win and score a lot of runs without that. So maybe that's not a huge part of what they look for. But, if you're talking about where could this team improve the most, well, when you're dead last in the league in on base percentage, then that is clearly where you can improve the most. The Braves are one of the worst teams in baseball in terms of walk rate. Again, especially when you take out Acuna, who, is far and away the best at that, in the Braves lineup. You take him out, it's very pedestrian, just straight up bad, really. So on base percentage, it would be, adding an outfielder that can, at least like a 340, 350 clip. You're not trying to go get, a Bryce Harper that's on base, 43% of the time, but just anything in the 340s, 350s would be a help, honestly, because the Braves are running out a lot of guys who are 290, 305, 310. That's tough, man. It's tough to string together any sort of offense that way, especially when the home runs aren't coming. And we've seen that too many times this year with the home run ball just goes dry. And listen, with this, the way they designed this and built this team, you know, when the home runs go dry, you desperately need somebody to get on base at some point to maybe generate a run. So, yeah, that's what I would say on base percentage. But I would also remind people that Alex does have a type. He's been very clear about that type for 6 years now. And I wouldn't be surprised if he stuck to it and just kind of, went doubled down on more power to see if he can wake the rest of this lineup up. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that's what he did.
Absolutely. And Scott, when you look at the power, when you look at the on base percentage, that's what kind of defines, the Braves wanting to be able to go get that type. But again, with less teams now being available to provide that type of outfielder, those teams know that they have assets to where they're going to want to milk as much value out of them. The Braves may not necessarily have as much out there as other teams will, like the ability to go get 3 or 4 outfielders, and the most valuable prospect you give up is the 21st prospect on your top 30 list, like they did in 2021. That's going to be hard to do. So your thoughts when it comes to just how much Alex Anthopoulos may be willing to pay? I know that we've got a few minor leaguers who have had some special seasons so far this year, but do you think it makes sense for Alex to pay a relevant, even to substantial cost for an outfielder that could really come in and change things for this lineup?
I think my first response to that is when a team is very much in a World Series contention window, my concern about the farm system and having a deep pipeline goes down a bit, because at the end of the day, your World Series window is only open for so long. And if you have an opportunity to add an impact player, you should go do it. And maybe you have to overpay a little bit in prospect, or maybe you have to take on a contract in order to get a player. But for the most part, I'm not overly concerned about the health of the farm system when the Braves are trying to win their second championship in 4 years. And I think with Alex, I know we talked about traits and what he looks for. I wanted to add another thing that I think is always something Alex has tried to do in the past is adding underperforming players. And sometimes people will see the surface level stats, like on a Pierce Johnson, for example. And I know Pierce is a reliever, and of course we're talking about outfielders tonight, but his surface numbers were terrible. But if you dug in a little bit deeper on the stats, you would see that Pierce Johnson's a very capable and talented reliever, had a great spin rate on his curveball, had great underlying metrics, even if his ERA was inflated. Those are the kind of players you look at. So when I look around the league, you look at a player like Taylor Ward out in Anaheim. Ward's numbers on the surface are nothing special. They're not bad, but they're not going to blow you away. But then he has one of the highest expected WOBAs in terms of the way he hits the ball, his exit velocities, his line drive rate. Those are things I think the front office really looks for. And I'm sure that some of our listeners are a little more on the traditional side of stats and others are more on the advanced and analytical side. But I do think when you're looking at players, you kind of have to dig a little bit deeper than what their surface numbers are. What's their exit velocity like? Are they running into bad luck? Is this just a down year? What trends do they have right now? All of that is going to factor into the equation. And there may not be a perfect outfielder out there for Alex, but I think he's just going to kind of have to weigh everything and try to add the best player for this year and potentially beyond.
And to piggyback on what Scott just said, if people remember, the Braves paid almost nothing in 2021 to get the 4 outfielders they brought in. Very, very little in terms of prospect costs. And the reason is because, Jorge Soler was having a terrible year with Kansas City before the Braves acquired him in 2021. Eddie Rosario was hurt and barely played at all for Cleveland in 2021. Jock Peterson was having a very mediocre year with Chicago in 2020. Like, this is exactly what Scott's talking about. Like, Alex bet on upside, and he bet on, batted ball numbers that were better than results. He decided that he would rather, pay less on a guy who maybe hasn't performed well, but they thought could perform well in a better lineup, and hope that works. And, like Scott said, that's just been Alex's MO. I mean, he is a find the hidden gem, find the unlocked value, and try to get more out of a guy than you give up in terms of cost. So yeah, just to piggyback on what Scott said, Alex has done this multiple times in the past. He's done it with the outfield. Obviously in 21, it had unbelievable results. Pretty much every move hit exactly the way they want. But yeah, Scott's 100% right. He doesn't always just go get the guy having the best year. A lot of times they go get the guy who they think might have a better second half than they had a first half, and get some value out of a deal where the cost maybe isn't quite as high.
And that's the question that I'll ask when it comes to that cost. Again, the way that they've been able to find value is, you're right. We've seen it time and time again. Atlanta, Kevin Seitzer, the hitting, for the hitting approach that's here. We do such a good job of getting value once a player comes versus where they were. But this leads to another interesting conversation, I think, because both of you have offered great insight on something that I myself have also been weighing as well. Going after a rental versus someone that's controlled. And we'll start kind of with those rental pieces. When you look at the on base percentage aspect of things, I think some rentals potentially stand out. I believe each of these players are going to be a free agent after the season. Some veteran names such as a Jesse Winker, a Tommy Pham, a Charlie Blackmon, those type of players. You don't have as much upside because those are older players. You don't have as much power upside either, but you do have players that could come in and can give you that on-base consistency that you're looking for. Probably are not going to cost as much because of the fact that they are rentals. Does that type of approach really make sense to either one of y'all? Cost is reasonable. You kind of know what you're getting, and it's someone that at the very least could help the on-base approach of the Braves. If one of those type of players were to be available, I think that they could make sense, and especially if you feel they could be better in Atlanta than where they are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, listen, the Braves have to weigh some interesting things here. Like, and I know Scott and I both talked about this on different occasions, but in 2025, the Braves have three outfielders under team control. They have Acuna, they have Michael Harris, and they have Jared Kelenic. And Marcell Ozuna, the guaranteed portion of Marcell Ozuna's contract is up. If they wanted to move Ronald Acuna to DH for the year, and they could do that and bring in an outfielder, but if you do that, then you lose Marcell Ozuna, right? And that's a huge piece. Like, that's a huge part of this is, if you want to bring back Marcell Ozuna, the Braves have a team option on him for next year that is very reasonable. If you want to bring him back, then that eats up your DH spot, which means then you didn't have three outfield spots for Acuna, Harris, and Kelenic. Which means if you want to go get a controllable outfielder that's got more years of team control after this year, then what are you going to do with him? Would be my question, because you're not going to ever sit Acuna if he's healthy. You're not ever going to sit Michael Harris if he's healthy. And Kelenic has already shown that he's been better as a full-time player than he ever was really as a platoon player. So under that lens, like, part-time rental outfielders make more sense just because they're cheaper. Obviously, we just talked about 21, how cheap Alex was able to get guys, but also because you don't have to worry about 2025 and fitting all of these outfielders in. I understand you can't have too much talent, but like you also, if you have three outfielders already locked up past this year and that is your plan for 2025, it's tough to go get a fourth outfielder who's a full-time player and make all of that work. So, could they do it? Yeah, they probably could. They probably could bring Ozuna back, have four full-time outfielders, spread the playing time around enough where everybody's happy, but that's not easy to do. And it's a lot to ask for the manager. And, manager's always got the guys that he likes the most. And I don't know, maybe Scott has a different opinion, but in my opinion, a rental outfielder just alleviates all of those problems. And if you want to bring him back in the offseason, you can, if you really love him, if he plays well. But acquiring an outfielder with a ton of team control, to me, it might solve some problems, but it also creates some problems. But I kind of want to hear what Scott thinks about this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating logjam. And I found myself just in a never-ending tweet storm a couple weeks back about this exact situation. Because if you're Alex Anthopoulos, obviously you're thinking about this year, but he's paid the big bucks to think about years down the road. And I think Alex basically has two choices here, and you just outlined them. You can add a rental, and admittedly, the rental market is not great on the surface in terms of outfielders. We could do a super deep dive on this, but just on the surface level, it's not like there are a half dozen rental outfielders who make a ton of sense for this team. But at the same time, if in the interest of winning this season, if you can go out and trade for a player who has control through 25 or 26 or even 27, you could always add that player and then figure it out in the wintertime. And maybe that gives you a better chance of winning in 24, knowing that then in November and December, Alex can potentially trade someone. It would also give them a little bit of insurance because we have no idea what Ronald Acuna Jr. is going to be able to do defensively next season. I think that is the big unknown right now. And Alex is going to have to operate as if he doesn't know, because frankly, there is very little precedent for players at Ronald's age in particular coming back from 2 torn ACLs in less than 4 years. Is he going to be able to play right field every day come April 1st next season? Do the Braves want him to play every single day? And I know we could probably talk about this for hours about next year's outlook on the team. But at the end of the day, it is very much a consideration that Alex is going to have to figure out whether he goes for a rental who may not be as good, or if he goes for a player with a couple of years of control and then tries to figure it out in the winter on what to do.
Absolutely. And I think I see both sides of the equation. I agree with Steven in that, you go for a rental. At the very least, you got someone that can help out your own base percentage. Maybe it's someone that could come here and do better again, like we've talked about, than they have elsewhere. But I also get Scott Case. And I think that there's multiple points to why you would maybe want to go after a controllable person. You probably are going to find more upside in the controllable talent. You could then take that controllable talent potentially and use them in a trade in the offseason to go get an arm that you need, because we're going to have plenty of arm questions about 2025 as well. And to Scott's point that he brought up, and to Steven's point as well, you're also going into next season with Ronald Acuna Jr. coming off a big injury, but you've also in general experienced plenty of injuries as a whole to your outfield this season. Michael Harris is also injured. This past offseason, after having so many pitching injuries in 2023, Alex Anthopoulos went out and got a whole bunch of arms. Maybe he sees the value in getting another, fourth outfielder, but someone that could start if you need it. So maybe he likes that control. So I think that there's plenty there to both sides. And I definitely think that Alex Anthopoulos, if he finds the right situation, to Scott's point, I think he will pay a notable price to go get it. But we've been talking about all these different parameters, all these different thoughts as to what type of outfitter we could go get. Scott, Steven, in whatever order you would like, just some names that intrigue you, a few names that stand out as being, okay, if we're really going to go out and maybe get a guy who can get on base and hit for power, what are a couple of names that stand out for you? Steven, go ahead.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I'm always tied to which teams are going to sell. Like, it's just hard to get past that. Like, I would love, like, for instance, if the Pirates were going to sell, right? Like, Brian Reynolds has been a name on the market for years. Would they ever pull the trigger on that? I have no idea, because we don't know if they're going to sell. Ian Happ for the Cubs, same thing. He's got, I think I looked this up a couple of days ago. Ian Happ's got like a 360 on base percentage this year. But the Cubs are only like 3 or 4 games out of the third wild card. So, like, who knows what they're going to do? Cody Bellinger's another name. Like, if the Cubs ended up selling, do they move Cody Bellinger? Jazz Chisholm is a name that Marlins people have brought up. Jesse Winker is a name from the Nationals. That's an obvious just because he's a rental. He has had some off-field stuff, some clubhouse stuff that I don't know that Alex would be terribly interested in, but maybe. I mean, who knows? The Tigers have got some interesting guys, but again, they're not that far out of it. It's just so, we're so tied to the buyers and sellers, and the extra playoff spot has really, I've railed against expanded playoffs enough on this podcast, but another problem with it is how much it's kind of watered down what it means to be a contender, which is in effect, created a situation where you have, I mean, right now we have 9 teams in the National League that are like within 3 games of the last wild card spot. 9 teams. That's crazy. I mean, there's only 15 teams in the league, and there's 9 of them within 3 games of the last wild card spot. So, until you know the sellers list, it's very hard to pick names. But one thing I do want to say in our last, what we were just talking about is I think in an absolutely perfect world, I think you would keep your DH spot open to allow Acuna to play DH whenever he needs to on a daily basis. I don't know if you can afford to do that with the way Ozuna has been hitting and the way the other guys haven't been hitting. But if we're just talking about in an absolute perfect world in terms of matching up outfielders with positions, I think in an ideal world, Acuna would have the DH spot for himself in 2025, and you would have three other outfielders who could all potentially be your everyday guys. That Acuna is not one of them. Um, I don't know if they can afford to do that until Matt Olson, Austin Riley, Ozzy Albies, till the guys start hitting the way they're supposed to hit. I just don't know if you can afford to take Azuna out of the lineup like that. But in a perfect world, I think Acuna would have the DH to himself next year. We'll see what happens. But yeah, in terms of names, it's tough. It's tough when you don't know who the sellers are. But those are a few guys that I have been watching to see if maybe their teams fall out. Jock Peterson with the Cardinals is with the Diamondbacks is another one if they fall out of it. But we'll have to wait and see what actually happens.
Yeah, I was going through MLB Trade Rumors just dropped their list of the top 50 trade candidates, and I would encourage folks to go take a look. There are a lot of names in there. There are quite a few outfielders, which is a good thing for the Braves. Steven mentioned the name Ian Happ. That's a name I would be very, very interested in because he gets on base. I would love to get Ian in like the second spot in this lineup if the Cubs decide to sell. He's a corner bat. He's under control for beyond this year. But again, you can figure that out in the wintertime. There's other names too when I go through. I mean, the dream would be Randy Arozarena from the Tampa Bay Rays. I don't think Tampa Bay is going to sell him, but the Rays also operate very differently. He is having a down season, so maybe there's a chance that they would be willing to trade Arozarena. That's probably far-fetched, but I can dream. I love Randy. If I had to guess, and this is a very official July 16th prediction, man, there's two players who stick out to me. Taylor Ward with the Angels is interesting because, as Steven talked about at length, Alex has very much a type, and Ward fits the type of a couple of those things. He's having an okay season with the Angels, but he has huge StatCast numbers. His exit velocity and expected numbers are way more than his 100 WRC plus. I would not be surprised if it's Taylor Ward for a couple of reasons. There's also a lot of familiarity with Los Angeles' front office with Alex and some folks who moved from Atlanta to Anaheim with Perry Manassian. So there's an obvious connection there. And then if Alex is going to go boring, I think Lane Thomas with the Nationals is interesting enough. He's having a decent year. He is unfortunately right-handed, which I think in a perfect world, he would be a lefty just to help balance things out a little bit with Duvall. But solid numbers from the right side, a lot of speed. He could fill in. I think he's a significant upgrade over what the Braves currently have. Otherwise, we know that that's a pretty low bar to clear. I would hope they could add somebody better than Lane Thomas, but I think Washington's clearly going to sell. And as a player who is not under control for much longer, he seems like a fallback option if other choices or preferred options fall apart.
And I think that the point that you bring up about Taylor Ward is so critical. He's the type that Alex likes. We have the familiarity with LA's front office. And like all those 2021 outfield candidates that we got in the past, when they were in their younger years, they showed star level potential at the plate, highly productive potential at the plate. They went down because of whatever occurred. But when you look at Eddie Rosario, Jorge Soler, Jock Peterson, they had tremendous seasons back, each of them 2018, 2019, and then they come to Atlanta and get back to those levels. Taylor Ward in the past has had that, not necessarily to that level, but has had success. He could get back to that level as well. An interesting name I find out there, though he really doesn't have the profile that Alex goes after because there's not a lot of power potential, but Isaiah Kiner Falefa of the Toronto Blue Jays, just someone who's got some versatility to potentially play in the infield or the outfield, can get on base, and has shown some versatility with the bat. Maybe someone like that is a singular source could help you out at shortstop or in the outfield if you need help at both places. Of course, I'd love to see us go get maybe an outfielder for the White Sox. You know, if the Braves feel they like Tommy Pham, if they want to get him and Paul DeYoung, I think that combo would be hard to get. And then as a buy low candidate who's got a few seasons left on him, I really like Jesus Sanchez of the Florida Marlins. I think there's a lot of power potential that you could play, you know, him with. He would be kind of a buy low like Jared Kelenic. Don't know how likely that is, but just some names out there that could make sense. But Scott, the whole thing is this, is that even when we talk about there not being a lot of teams, the thing to remember though is that when it comes to Alex Anthopoulos, I think more than most GMs, he's going to go through all these scenarios. He's going to consider all these perspectives, and for someone as resourceful as he's proven to be in the past, even when there's not just a perfect candidate out there, at the end of the day, he may even bring multiple candidates in. One thing to remember, he's been here before, and if there's anybody who can do it once again, it's him.
Yeah, I think especially with his in-season moves, Alex has earned a lot of benefit of the doubt. And he's not going to bat 1,000 because nobody bats 1,000. But I do have confidence that he's going to go out there and adequately assess his team and say, hey, we need to add an impact outfielder here. And it may not be a superstar, but I would be a little surprised if Alex adds someone and we all jump on here for an emergency podcast. And it's kind of like a womp womp kind of reaction of, okay, I guess he's a little better than Adam Duvall, or I guess he's a little better than Eddie Rosario. I would imagine that Alex is going to go out there. The farm system does have a little bit of depth right now. They have some intriguing players at premium positions. You know, Drake Baldwin is I think if the Braves are going to add an impact outfielder, Drake Baldwin, who was just in the futures game, is a catcher. The Braves obviously have Sean Murphy locked up for years. Presumably, they're going to keep Travis d'Arnaud around for a few more seasons as well because of what he does on and off the field. So if you're asking me to pick a prospect who could be moved in the next couple of weeks, I would guess that Baldwin is probably the one I would pick from the top 5 or top 10 of the farm. But I think, again, Alex has also shown a desire to not trade his prospects whenever he can do it. And that situation may or may not present itself in the next 2 weeks ahead of the deadline. But I do ultimately think that Alex is going to give this team a real chance to make a push by adding an impact player to this lineup. And if you can add a good enough hitter in right field, all of a sudden your lineup 1 through 8 looks pretty damn good. It's really just that 9th spot with Orlando Arcia that you're not loving. And that's fine. Right now, the Braves only have 5 or 6 hitters that they feel good about. But if you're going to get Michael Harris back, you're going to get an outfielder, presumably. You can do a whole lot worse than what the Braves will be running out there 1 through 8, especially if guys like Matt Olson and Ozzie Albies pick it up in the second half.
And I will say this, because I was just sitting here thinking about it. There is a scenario that makes sense. Like, let's say Alex wants to go get Luis Robert. Let's just hypothetically say, okay, I want to go big. I want to go big. They the White Sox love Drake Baldwin. The White Sox love Nacho Alvarez. Pick your top prospect that it would take. There is a scenario where if you go get a guy that good, where he's got multiple years of team control, then you could potentially let Ozuna walk at the end of the year because you've essentially replaced him with a guy like Luis Robert.
Yeah,
and then
that's a good point.
Acuna could DH in 2025. Like, if you go big enough for your addition this year, you do actually create a scenario where you can let Ozuna walk next year and it's not going to kill you as bad. So there is a threshold where it actually does make more sense to go bigger than smaller. I don't know if they'll do it, but as I was listening to Scott talk, that scenario popped in my head where, like, it does actually make some sense.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that one thing, and Scott, you hit on this point, but this Braves pitching staff, it enters the All-Star break leading the majors in earned run average. We just had 3 starters from our staff, a staff that's lost Spencer Strider, unfortunately, for the season, but 3 other starters, including 2 who are in their first year with the franchise go to the All-Star game. If that pitching staff can remain healthy, we have ingredients here to be able to put together the type of run that you have seen many teams do, that we did in 2021 to win the World Series title. We are a World Series contender, and we've just recently seen our offense in the 10 games before the All-Star break. They scored 5+ runs in 8 of those 10 games. Yes, they were shut out in the other 2. But if this team can just at least get a boost from somewhere, even if it's not a superstar, if it's just a notable player who can offer a bit more consistency than some of the other outfield options we've got, if we can get back to scoring those 4, 5, 6 runs a game, this team is a really good spot to potentially go on one of those runs. So anyone who's thinking, well, maybe it's not worth investing in this team, it's worth it, because this team's pitching staff has the talent to be able to win a title. And I think that's going to motivate Scott to, or is going to motivate Alex Anthopoulos, to your point, Scott, to want to go get something done and something notable done.
Yeah, and hey, if Alex wants to make me assistant GM, I'd be down. Give me a call, Alex. No, he doesn't need my yapping in his front office. Yeah, I mean, clearly this team has a lot of components of a World Series champion. High-end starting pitching at the top of the rotation, a lights-out bullpen as a whole. Maybe we are guilty on the podcast of not giving the bullpen its flowers for just being a really great and consistent group all year long. And then the lineup, yes, there are players underperforming. Yes, there have been a bunch of injuries, but if you can get healthy and stay healthy, you get a bounce back from a couple players, and then you can add an outfielder. We just talked about how deep this lineup suddenly looks, while also being pretty solid defensively. You can absolutely see this team making a run. We could do our whole rant about how random the playoffs have become, and we don't have to go down that whole rabbit hole right now. But clearly, man, you can't just say, well, okay, maybe this isn't our best team, we're not going to go out and improve it. Of course not, because we can't predict the future. And if you're telling me the Braves can get to October with a healthy Sale and Fried and Lopez, a very deep bullpen, and a lineup that's going to hopefully find some more consistency in the second half, and I think it will, why not the Braves? Maybe they aren't going to go in with the best record, but as we've seen the last couple of couple of playoffs, going in as the number 1 or the number 2 seed does not mean a single thing, especially in the National League.
And I'll add this. We haven't really adjusted our thinking, because in the offseason, the constant conversation was how big of a question mark the rotation is going to be in 2025 when we're losing all these guys. But, Alex went and got Chris Sale for multiple years. He went and got Ronaldo Lopez for multiple years. Spencer Swallenbach has come on, who's got multiple years of team control. All of a sudden, like the 2025 rotation, you get Strider back, you have Sale, you have Lopez, you have Swallenbach, maybe you get Morton back. And even if you don't get Morton back, it's going to get a back end starter. Like the 2025 rotation suddenly doesn't have as many question marks as it did maybe in the winter when we didn't have Lopez, we didn't have Sale, we didn't know about Schwellenbach. And I do think that's relevant to this conversation, because if you were looking at the 2025 rotation as still this huge question mark, then maybe if you're Alex, you're saving some of your prospects, like you're saving some of your resources, you're saving some of your dollars, because you've got some pretty big holes to fill in the wintertime. And maybe you don't, push as hard for an outfielder right now. But now that is not as big of a question as it was maybe even 3-4 months ago, this team all of a sudden doesn't really have that many holes going into next year outside of, we got to figure out the outfield, or we got to figure out DH. We got to figure out something for this year. Do we do multiple years to spill over into next year? What do we do with Ozuna? That kind of becomes the biggest question. And so once again, it does kind of justify maybe spending a little bit more, going a little bit bigger on that acquisition right now, because you don't have those massive holes in the roster, that maybe we thought we would even 3 or 4 months ago. So it is going to be to see how they allocate resources, given the emergence of guys like Sale and Lopez and Swallenbach, to really solidify not only the rotation this year, but the rotation, next year, the year after. It's a lot less scary than it was even a few months ago.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, the one thing that stands out for a general manager like Alex Anthopoulos, who again is creative and resourceful and just, is consistently making moves that wind up making sense. Again, just look at what he's done with Kellenic, Sale, as well as Ronaldo Lopez. Getting an asset at this trade deadline that could help now and potentially could be here as an asset in the future, that's a good problem to have. And it certainly is something that I think Alex Anthopoulos, he's looking to do what makes the most sense for this year right now. But while he also is considering years ahead, I think that, he looks forward to, hey, if I can get something that can help me now and potentially can give me options to choose from in the future, that type of option could be worth investing in. But Scott, Stephen, the reason why I always enjoy talking with y'all is because obviously y'all are two of the best when it comes to breaking down the game in Braves country. Always learn so much and just enjoy y'all's perspectives. Do either one of y'all have anything to end on as we wrap up this edition of the Hammer Territory podcast?
No, nothing really on my end. We felt like this was a great opportunity to do a bit of a deep dive on the roster and look ahead to the trade deadline, which is July 30th. So we are 2 weeks away. It is very quickly approaching. And with no games for a couple of days, we thought, why not? Let's do it. I thought that this was a great conversation. And man, isn't it just fun to be talking about a really good Braves team, maybe a team that hit some roadblocks in the first half, but at the end of the day, they're 11 games up. They're firmly in the playoffs. And the fact that they have navigated such choppy waters and they are in the position they're in with 2.5 months to go in the season, it's just fun. It's fun to talk about. Hopefully it's fun to listen to. And we're going to do another show here in the next day or two, just kind of doing a deeper look at the roster. So be sure to keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with everything Scott said. This is one of my favorite things to do, quite honestly, is just talk roster and trade stuff. I think I've talked myself into like going to get Luis Robert, if I'm being honest, like just go get him and figure out 2025. I don't know if they'll do it. I do think they have the high end AAA talent to do it, both position player and pitching wise, with Baldwin and Nacho having the years they've had. So I think they could do it. And I think it does maybe solve some problems with maybe letting Ozuna go at next year. So yeah, I've kind of fallen in love with that move. I'd love for them to do it. I don't think they will. I think he'll go a little more measured. Alex is much smarter than we are. So we'll see what they do. But yeah, I agree with everything Scott said. It's a ton of fun. We appreciate it, all the support that we've gotten, and Shawn, very much appreciative of you kind of quarterbacking this whole conversation. But yeah, it's been fun and obviously a lot more to get to in the next couple of weeks.
And this is where we enjoy it the most, not only getting to talk with each other, as Scott and Stephen both said, but this time of year, I don't want to speak for Scott or Stephen, but I don't think that it would be, in any way, shape, or form wrong to suggest it's kind of like Christmas to all of us because we get to, enjoy talking about the potential moves the Braves can make for a championship run. But we want to make sure that that we're going to continue to, pipe out a lot of content when it comes to trade discussions. The Braves have a big series against the Cardinals coming up this weekend. The two teams right now at the top of the wild card race in the National League. So plenty to get to over the next week, but watch out for that next episode in which we will have, more in-depth conversation about the roster as a whole and what potentially could occur. Of course, Hammer Territory, as part of the Foul Territory family of podcasts, they had a great interview with Chris Sale earlier today. Make sure you check out the latest Foul Territory podcast to be able to see that. And of course, for Scott Coleman at Scott Coleman 55 on X/Twitter, Stephen Tolbert at _Outliers. My name's Shawn Coleman at StatsSAC. Thanks for joining us on this All-Star Week edition of Hammer Territory. Make sure you check out Hammer Territory across all forms of social media. Until next time, go Braves. We'll talk to you again soon here on the Hammer Territory podcast.